Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Covering the 2014 elections, Wisconsin Eye is in Wauwatosa, interviewing Governor Scott Walker of Wauwatosa, a Republican seeking his second term. Governor, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. I want to try to touch on a few issues that didn't come up on Friday's debate.
Sure, yeah.
Here's the first one. 4 years ago, you said public employees were the haves and taxpayers who paid for their salaries and fringe benefits were the have-nots. 4 years later, are public employees still the haves, sir?
Well, I think it started to balance out a little bit. I remember my brother, who is a couple years younger, said to me back in the middle of this debate, he said, "I'd love to have what you're offering." He works as a banquet manager, part-time bartender for years. His wife sells appliances at Sears. I mean, they're just a typical working family in the state. And at the time, he pointed out to me that for him and his family, he was putting about $800 a month aside out of his paycheck to pay for his health insurance and the little bit he could set aside his 401k. He said, "I'd love to have what you're offering. This is not a problem. This would be a great thing for most folks in the state." So it's gotten a little bit closer. It's still pretty generous. And we appreciate the good work that the vast majority of good, decent public servants do in the state. So I'm not trying to pit one against the other. But it did kind of level the playing field in the sense that most people in the state are paying 20 to 25% or more for the health insurance. Most people are matching their pension to their 401k. We've suddenly started to get the public sector a little bit more aligned with where the rest of the society is.
Is it level, or public employees still have better benefits?
It's closer. I mean, it's still, if you look at the, the state is a little over 12% on the health insurance premium. We set that as the basic level. Now, districts, local school districts, cities, towns, villages, counties can go higher than that, and some have. So some are more in line with that 20 to 25%. But we gave them the flexibility.
Do you think future public employees, and I'm not talking the current ones, should they have a pension plan more like a 401k plan instead of a
the nice thing about Wisconsin is that we have something that's really unique. We have a base, a core plan, so we kind of have that. We have a quasi 401k pension mix already. Okay. The base is a traditional pension, but then the component above the core operates more like a traditional 401k would, in the sense that annuitants, retirees, share in both the risk and the reward. A few years back, remember when the economy was bad, particularly 2009, 2010, in that era, they were taking a little bit of a hit. In the last couple of years, as the economy's gotten better here and across the country, they've shared in the reward, and so it does have a bit of that component. So it's part of the reason why we're the only state in the country with a fully funded pension system.
Well, if you're reelected, would you make overhaul of the WRS a goal, sir?
No, I think from our standpoint, because we've got that kind of a system, we've looked at that in other states, other jurisdictions. I even looked at it when I was at the county. The key here is you really, because you've got that kind of hybrid of the two, you have the benefits of both. You have the stability of a pension, but you also have the flexibility in terms of the cost to the taxpayers of a 401k by that core plan.
The Policy Research Institute study recently said, let's expand the sales tax base and you could lower income and property taxes. Are you willing to consider that, sir?
That's not on my radar. I'm not looking at an overall increase in sales tax or even in terms of what the base is. What I'm looking at is continuing to do things that build a healthier economy, to drive down, to combine that with driving down expenditures in areas where there's waste, fraud, and abuse, and then to keep reinvesting that into lower income and property taxes. That's my goal 4 years from now, is both those to be lowered, to be ideally dramatically lower than they are today. But I'd like to see that through growth and through doing more to weed out the waste, fraud, and abuse. We've done it pretty well the first term. I still think there's more that we can do. A good example I give is, an analogy I often give is, Tonette and I in February will have been married 22 years. And one of the big mistakes I made as a newlywed, not long after a wedding, was I went to Kohl's, actually not too far from here, and bought something at the price it was marked at. And my wife was kidding me. She said, you can never go back there again until you learn how to shop there. So now, if I'm going to go buy a new Packers shirt, I go to that rack in the front that says it was $29.99 and now it's $19.99. Then I get up to the cash register and I pull up my Kohl's credit card and get another 10 or 15% off. Then I get the Sunday insert out and take 10% more off on top of that. And then, because Tonette and the boys and I go there all the time, we get out our Kohl's cash, and next thing you know, they're paying me to buy that shirt. Well, not quite, but it kind of feels like it. So I always ask people, when I bring this up at meetings, town halls, factories, and other visits across the state, when I'm talking about it, how does Kohl's make money? You know, how's a good Wisconsin company like Kohl's make money? They make it off of volume. They could charge you a lot per shirt, or they could lower the price, spread the volume out there, and make more money off of that. And that's really my view when it comes to taxes. I could have high rates and a few people could pay them, but as I lower the rates, it does more to fuel the economy, and that's how we're going to drive future reductions in both property and income taxes.
Well, let's talk about that. Do you want major shifts or major changes in our tax structure to be a major part of a second term, if you get it, sir?
I would like to keep chipping away so that at a minimum, property and income taxes are lower 4 years from now. Rates across the board and property taxes on a typical home will be lower in 2018 than they are this December, which, by the way, on property taxes, they're actually lower than they were 4 years ago because of our reforms. Typical families seeing about $322 more in their pocket overall because of our reforms. I want to keep doing that, but to me, I don't want to shift it by saying, okay, we did that by raising raising sales taxes to offset the cuts in income and property taxes. I want to keep the overall sales tax, the state's general sales tax, where it's at, but find ways to keep chipping away at both property and income.
So you consider broadening the sales tax base, raising the sales tax, sir? Mm-hmm. Okay. But I was intrigued yesterday at the State Journal with this idea you threw out. Yeah. Sales tax on gasoline, but here's my question. If you have the sales tax, 5% on a $3 gallon of gas, it raises 15 cents. But right now, our gas tax, as you know, is 30.9 cents, hasn't been increased since 2006. Right. So would you have to then raise the sales tax if you're going to charge it?
Well, the sales tax, and this is just qualified, this is just an idea, which I pointed out repeatedly to them.
It's a trial balloon you floated.
Of the different options that we have out there. And we've been talking to stakeholders. But it's really to replace, not to have to treat the sales, or to add the sales tax that currently exists to that. It's to say, take the place of the gas tax, get rid of the gas tax, and have a sales tax just on gasoline to fuel the transportation system. With the idea being that really the problem we have right now is not only that well, two things. We're too reliant on the gas tax. Almost all of our transportation budget's based on a gas tax to a little bit extent on vehicle registration fees. So the over-reliance on just a narrow number of revenues is one part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that the gas tax keeps going down. As cars become more fuel efficient, the number of gallons purchased has gone down, even though the price is going up. And so if you're basing your revenues off of gallons of gas, not the price of gas, the wear and tear on a fuel-efficient car is no different than one that's a gas guzzler. It still causes potholes. It still causes problems out there. And so our sense is that we can convert from a gas tax to a sales tax as one of the options we're looking at. That would actually give us at least a stable form of funding in the future, as opposed to the gas tax at both the state and at the federal level that continues to go down.
But if you did that, is your goal to raise more money because of the pending shortfalls of $600 million, $700 million?
No, I think it's part of the gap that we have is based on the assumption that gas taxes continue to go down. Mm-hmm. Here, replacing it, having a swap, even if you just looked at, we'll have to look at a variety of things, but even if you just did it with some degree of neutrality, there would just at least be that stability of it not going down like the gas tax is. Then the overall, I mean, the one thing clear is I'm not going to sign off on a budget that doesn't reduce the overall tax burden. So if property taxes, income taxes are going down, and revenues are there for transportation, I'll sign off on it. But I want the burden for the typical taxpayer in the state to go down.
When you say that, do you, are you talking just our GPR budget or GPR plus transportation, sir?
Well, I think everything, the whole deal. What is the impact when a budget's been signed and put into effect? What's the impact on the typical family? What's the impact on the state as a whole? And my bottom line on any of these different options is we need to lower the overall tax burden in the state.
The $75 that you pay on your Saturn and that I pay on my car, that hasn't been increased since 2008. Is it time to consider raising that, sir?
Those are all things that we'll look at, but again, it's got to be as part of an overall package where the burden on the typical family, the typical taxpayer, the people of the state as a whole has to go down.
What about that recommendation 2 years ago that annually you would report to the DOT how many miles traveled? Your opponent says that sounds too much like Big Brother. Are you also a critic of that?
Yeah, it's a time, and I said it then, I say it again now. To me, it just, there's not a practical, not only for those concerns, but it's just practically speaking. I mean, I get why people floated the idea out there, but it just practically doesn't make sense. And in a way, it's very much like paying your property taxes. You pay it all at once. I think it would make it difficult for people to pay. Not to mention, how do you actually how do you go about collecting that? How do you go about doing that? I just think that's an unworkable option out there.
Can I ask you to put in context the term you used in the debate that Wisconsin has a work problem? Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that, sir?
Well, we put in context of the jobs. We inherited a big jobs problem. 133,000 jobs were lost. That's why I set that big goal years ago of 250,000 jobs, because I realized these were real people. Some of the people I mentioned the other night in the debate, Sandy from the Wausau area, or Michael from Heartland or elsewhere, excuse me. And I realized that, in these jobs that we were losing back then in the 4 years before I took office, these not only were real people, they had real families and real communities all across the state. So I set a big goal, 250,000 jobs. We've come a long way, but we're not done yet. It's part of the reason why I'm running again. But one of the other challenges I hear repeatedly, this week alone, if you go to jobcenterwisconsin.com, there's more than 70, almost 80,000 job openings posted on that website. I hear from employers every week, sometimes every day, who say, I have jobs, I just don't have enough people to fill those jobs. And it boils down to two areas. Skilled workers, it's why part of our plan for the future, our 62-page comprehensive plan called Continuing Wisconsin's Comeback, that's on scottwalker.com. Part of our plan lays out something we call Learn More to Earn More, investments in apprenticeships, in our schools, our technical colleges, UW system, to get more people the education and skills they need to succeed. But then the other part ties in to the fact that I also hear from employers that say, that's great, love the fact you invested over $100 million in the worker training, but they'll tell me, I just need basic workers and I'll train them myself, but I can't get people who can work and who can pass a basic drug test. And so part of our point is there are jobs out there, but we need to get people the skills and the training, and in some cases, when it comes to public assistance, the motivation that they need to get back in the game.
Do you think you can get to your goal of 250,000 new private sector jobs by the end of a second term, sir? Mm-hmm. You do?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's one of those where, we had, I think people realistically see what happened. The first 2 years were a tremendous challenge for us because of the protests. When you've got 100,000 people in and around the Capitol. Later that fall, you had recalls to the Senate. Then you had recalls against me and the other senators out there. There's no doubt. If you talk to anybody who's being honest, who's a small business owner, they'll tell you the number one concern they have is uncertainty in anything. And that created a lot of uncertainty in the state by the people who came in and brought all this havoc on us in response to what we did. The bottom line is a lot of good things have happened since then. If you look at the trends, give you two indicators. You look at the year-over-year numbers, so not just back 3.5 years, but year-over-year, from July through July, this year to last year to this year, we ranked third in the Midwest. From August last year to August this year, we ranked fourth. Either way, third or fourth, we're in the top 5. Tremendous growth out there, lowest unemployment rate we've seen since October of 2008. Really good trend for the future. And projecting out, Manpower, which is a globally recognized company from here in Wisconsin, they do by jurisdiction, by state, they do surveys of employers as to how many are expecting to grow, stay the same, or retract. Yes. The net projection, the increase of net employers that are looking to grow in this quarter, this fourth quarter in Wisconsin, is double, more than double than it was last year at the same time. So a lot of really strong indicators, and I think that allows us to catch up from some of the stuff we lost out that first 1.5 to 2 years.
Let's talk about health care. Getting ready for the show, I was surprised to learn that our MA caseload in September, 1.18 million. It's never been higher, and for the first time, our MA program is going to cost $8 billion. That's both state and federal funds, GPR and federal funds. The American Hospital Association says our MA reimbursement rate's second lowest. If you're reelected, would you recommend a raise in those rates?
That's certainly something we'll look at, not only for hospitals, but other providers, dentists, doctors, you name it. And I think it would be part of a process where some of the reforms we're putting in are trying to help people. Now, for those who legitimately need our care, we've actually protected needy families, children, seniors, pregnant women, and children on down the line. We've actually expanded some of those areas. For the first time ever, we covered everyone living in poverty. As you know, under my predecessors, there actually was a wait list because of some promises made, but the failure to put money in to cover all the people living in poverty. We now cover them all, and so we think Medicaid is legitimately for people living in poverty, and for certain groups even beyond that, like kids, pregnant women, senior citizens, far beyond the poverty level. But for an adult without children who needs our assistance, we'll provide it. But part of our goal with some of the things I just talked about, with employability training, with drug tests, with other things, is we want to remove some of the disincentives to work. When I talk to employers now, they constantly tell us, hey, I got jobs, I have people apply. They come in and look at what we have to offer, and they tell us they're better off under all the different public assistance, from Medicaid, the Badger Care Plus program, food stamps, all the other programs that they have. They just find that it's difficult to justify going back to work. We got to change that. That's not only not good for the taxpayers, it's not good for employers who desperately need workers these days. We're hiring signs up all over the state of Wisconsin. But most importantly, it's not good for the person. I mean, true freedom and prosperity doesn't come from the mighty hand of the government. It comes from empowering people to control their own lives and their own destinies through the dignity that comes from work. And we're shorting people if we don't empower them, for those who are able, to have that dignity that comes from work.
Department of Health Services, as you know, has asked for a GPR upper, $760 million. If you're going to maintain your goal of covering everybody under the poverty level, you don't have any choice but to fund that increase, do you, sir?
Yeah, again, well, part of what we're going to look at is what additional reforms and where do we think we can go for, again, those particularly with the groups of people that we move back and forth are people who are able-bodied adults without children. I mean, these are childless adults as they define it technically. These are adults without kids who are able to work, and so that's all the more incentive. We just put in this last budget $17 million. We're one of the few states in the country that does this. $17 million into employability training. Other states have taken the waiver. They don't require work or signing up for one of these programs to get assistance in things like food stamps. We now require that. We're one of the few in the country that does that. But for me, like I said, it's good for the taxpayers, because if we can be truly successful over the next 2 years on that, we'll reduce the number of people who are on all levels of assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, unemployment compensation. But we'll also have put more people into the workforce, which is good for them, and it's good for employers. I am convinced part of that phrase you mentioned before is one of the reasons why I mentioned is we have a bit of a work challenge out there, is we have employers who are so desperate to fill positions out there that they're not taking on as much work, as many customers, as many opportunities to take on more work as they could, because they don't have enough confidence they can fill positions. Part of the reason why, even though I'm not a big spender, we put $28 million more this summer alone into our technical colleges to buy down the wait list in key areas like advanced manufacturing, like IT, like healthcare, and other areas where there's huge demand out there, not just to fill those positions, but because we know if we do, a lot of those employers will add more work.
Do you think making those on who are getting public aid take a drug test, do you think that'll cut our MA caseload, Governor?
I don't know if it will or will not. I just see that the main reason for me doing this, tying it in with our employability skills, is unlike other states that have looked at this where it was viewed as being punitive, our goal is to get people ready for work. In manufacturing, in healthcare for sure, in construction and transportation, so many of these areas, that one of the basic requirements to get a job in these job openings is passing a drug test. If we don't require that for those seeking our assistance, we're just setting up to fail once a job becomes available. And like I said, we had this week alone almost 80,000 job openings just on our site, let alone all the other places trying to hire people out there. If there are that many jobs out there, if we know that people are gladly hire folks if they can pass a drug test and they have basic employability skills, why would we be setting them up for failure if we didn't demand that they do that just to get the assistance in the first place?
I read about one governor who's considering or going ahead with privatizing MA. Is that under consideration in Wisconsin, sir?
That's not an item we put on the table, but I mean, again, for us, we're constantly looking at other states for things that they do to see what works and what doesn't work in both parties. I mean, a couple of years ago, Jack Merkel, a Democrat from Delaware, was the head of the National Governors Association. I worked close, in fact, on the executive board with Jack. he pushed something called the Better Bottom Line, which was an initiative to help people with disabilities get placed into the workforce and find the unique opportunities for them in the workforce. I announced that in my State of the State address, used in fact the same phrase, a better bottom line, because we had reached out to Jack and his staff and said, hey, do you mind if we take this program? Do you mind if we even use the name? We'll take great ideas. So if that idea works somewhere else, we'll do it, just like we did with Governor Markell's idea and applied it here in Wisconsin.
In June, the EPA released a draft rule with the goal of cutting coal-burning emissions from utilities by 30% by 2030.
Yep.
You support that goal?
No. Well, the goal, I don't support the rule.
Okay.
I mean, to me, the best way to be green is to make green or save green. And so the idea of having a cleaner environment, cleaner natural resources in the state, certainly I support that. But I think the problem is we've made great strides over the past decade. We made a number of changes. Our utilities have been at the forefront of that. Our state has been at the forefront of that. We continue to do things. In fact, give you a good example of something we do that most people don't know about. We actually provide, there's a grant program we've maintained even in these tough budgets that works with motor carriers. We have a ton of motor carriers, some big, some small, small as a mom and pop out there with an individual rig, some as big as Schneider up in the Green Bay area. One of the big challenges motor carriers had in the past is when their drivers hit their time limit per their CDL, they pull over, they get a rest, they take a nap, they sleep, they pop popcorn, they watch TV. All those things can only be done in their rigs if their engine's idling. That's a huge amount of expense. It's a large amount of emissions. So we have a program that the state supports where we provide a grant. We don't provide the full amount. That helps motor carriers go out and buy small generators that they attach to those rigs so they can switch off the engine and run their power for the inside of their rigs off of that much more efficient generator than keeping the engine itself idling. Well, that's a good example where when we did that, that encouraged them to take the savings, because it not only cuts emissions down, it dramatically reduces the cost of gas for those motor carriers, those trucking companies, and they reinvest that back into getting more of those generators. That's a good example where to be green, it's great, but the way you make it sustainable is by saving green or making green. In this case, they save money, they reinvest it. The challenge with this rule, and I've fought against this, I've joined with other governors to reach, I even brought it up to the president when he came into town on Labor Day, that I sent a letter to the EPA administrator on this, is this will cost ratepayers money individually here in the state, and it will cost us tens of thousands of jobs if it's not modified. I'm full square aggressive in pushing to pull back on this proposed rule. I think it's a contrast to my opponent who, when asked in your comments and even when asked about what she disagrees with the president on, has really shied away from that.
I want to ask you a question that Paul Ryan was asked last night. Is climate change man-made, Governor?
Forgive my allergies. Well, I think climate change, I think there's reality that it's out there. The question is how much of it is man-made and how much of it is just a part of nature out there. And I don't know that the evidence is conclusive as to how much of it's out there. I mean, as men and women in this world, we have some impact. We've had impact in the past. I think the bigger question is, what are we going to do about preserving our natural resources? And I think you can have a healthy balance between the two. You can do things that are both environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable. Some of the conservation efforts, the thing I just mentioned, are out there. I first brought that phrase up when we were at Orion, a company up in Manitowoc that makes those Apollo sky domes and some other things that help companies like manufacturers and distribution centers draw light off of the sun and reduce the amount of energy they have to use to illuminate their businesses or their warehouses. Those are all things we can be doing. But we shouldn't be doing things that are viewed as being environmentally sustainable, but wreak havoc on the economy. The two have got to be tied together. You can be both environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable. I think the problem with these proposed EPA rules is they err too much on one side, and for a little bit of change, the cost to ratepayers in the state and the cost to particularly manufacturers and folks in the agricultural sector would be devastating.
You want to freeze tuition on the tech college campuses for 2 years. As I interview both legislators and candidates, they say, I've got to see the details because they're afraid that state aid would not replace that tuition increase. Every 1% increase in tuition in tech college raises $2.4 million. Would your next budget, if you're reelected, backfill what they're not getting through tuition?
Well, we would tie in, not even just in that regard, what we've done recently, and we started in the last budget, we added to it this summer, we put $28 million more in our technical colleges. The investments we're making there are specific to what they're producing. So the $28 million we offered this summer was to provide almost 5,000 new slots this fall in key areas where they had to justify at each of the 16 campuses what they were spending that money on. So it wasn't just, here's $28 million, now divvy it up amongst the 16 of you.
It was say to lower those waiting lists?
For welding, diesel technicians, no, you're right, diesel technicians, early childhood development, public safety, IT, computer design, certified nursing assistants, all of those were areas where they had classes where they had a wait list. And campus by campus, we went through and gave them the money to buy down those wait lists in those key areas. My goal going forward, not just when it comes to tuition freeze, but just in general, is to say the investments we're going to make in higher education, be it our tech colleges or a UW system, are going to really be driven by what's the output, what's the performance, what do we get in return for that. So we're not just giving blank checks, but what do we actually see out of that? I think particularly in our technical colleges, they are perfectly suited to do that. We've had some really high performers across the state. We want to make sure everybody's a part of that.
You put out a very simple statement in the middle of the summer saying the state of Wisconsin should withdraw from the Common Core standards. If you're reelected, what's going to be your next steps on that issue, sir?
Yeah, for us, I want high standards. I have two kids that went to great schools here in Wauwatosa. I've got two nieces who are still in the public school system in the state. I want high standards. I'm proud of the fact, that under our reforms, graduation rates have gone up 4 years in a row, third grade reading scores are up. In particular, on this issue, ACT scores have gone up. We're the second best in the country. So I want standards in Wisconsin for our local schools that are better than the standards we see across the country. What I don't like is standards that are set by people from outside of the state of Wisconsin. And so my view is we should get out of that. We should put in place a kind of group that we put together a couple years ago when we did an in-state alternative to the federal mandate No Child Left Behind. People oftentimes in discussing this forget that we very successfully found a Wisconsin-specific alternative to No Child Left Behind. It was technically called the School District and School Accountability Program. It really led to our report cards for our schools so that parents can see both by district and by school how their schools are performing. I think that was a very positive alternative to the mandate from the federal government of No Child Left Behind. This is slightly different in that it's not solely a federal mandate like No Child Left Behind was, but it does come from a national, not a within-state basis. And so all I'm saying is let's get rid of being a part of the nationally designated component. Let's put in place the same sort of group of parents, teachers, educators, business leaders, and others who care about this issue from across the state. And let's have standards that meet the local and state needs, not just the national needs.
DNR says that more than half of the frac sand mines in the state have not been checked yet. Are you concerned that the half that haven't been checked are violating either air or water standards, sir?
Well, we've been aggressive with putting more positions, and we've actually added 2 positions in the last budget. We're going to do even more. I mean, thanks to God and the glaciers, we have some of the best industrial sand in the country for these sorts of projects out there. And we don't want to slow the growth because in those parts of the state where most of these operations are at, they've been a tremendous boom, both in terms of the construction jobs. You get people like the operating engineers and other union leaders out there that say this has been a great boom for construction, combined with the people in many of these rural areas where there's high unemployment who now have permanent jobs in those areas. But we need to make sure that, again, that balance I talked about between the economic boom but making sure we can keep up with it. So we're going to put more staff. That's part of our budget in the future. We'll do just like we did 2 years ago. We'll put more staff in to make sure we can monitor the air quality, keep up the pace on those, so we can both ensure that legitimate operators can go forward in the state and that we protect neighbors and other citizens within those areas.
Okay, almost out of time, so I've just got a couple more questions. The photo ID, even the U.S. Supreme Court justices wondered about the timing. Do you think voters could have been informed? Could we have pulled off that photo ID law?
Well, the irony is that the courts brought that on themselves. If the courts had ruled on this sooner, we wouldn't have a problem timing. People act as though we just passed the law. We passed the law, and I signed it 3 years ago.
2011.
It's already been in place. I used it just down the way here at my polling place, Jefferson Elementary School, in the spring of 2012. I voted with my voter ID when the law was still in effect, And as I recall at the time, I don't remember any media outlets in the state pointing to any problems that were created by that law. And so we kind of almost forget, because of the timing, the late nature of the ruling initially by Judge Edelman at the federal level, then the time it took to go through the Court of Appeals and ultimately get to the Supreme Court, that's something they brought on. If Judge Edelman had ruled a year or so ago, had ruled earlier on this, we'd already have a position where there's more than enough time to accommodate. So it's not the legislature, it's not the governor, it's not the administration that caused the timing issue on this. It was the courts themselves.
Do you think we're going to see photo ID for the 2016
Yeah, I think I think it will ultimately be upheld. I think in the end, the law should be constitutional. It's one of those we can make the case. And for those, excuse me, for those who, well, two parts, who question whether or not there's evidence. I mean, go back to 2008. The Milwaukee Police Department itself gave a whole comprehensive report on problems in the 2004 presidential election. There have been a series of examples they gave, and they even pointed to the fact, a simple question of why were there voting jurisdictions where there were more ballots cast than there were actually voters registered to vote at. How does that happen? So some legitimate concerns out there. I think photo ID makes it easy to vote, but hard to cheat. We made the accommodations to make those photo IDs available for free upon request. We've added additional accommodations to make sure that people can get the documentation they need to do that. And it's not, even under the system that's going to happen now because of the Supreme Court, there's still limitations. You can only vote at certain times. You can only vote in certain places. You can't just wake up and decide I'm going to go vote at the mall. In a free society, there's certain things, responsibilities you have to do to be able to vote, and the time frame in which you can operate. We just thought this was a reasonable accommodation to protect the integrity of each and every vote.
Okay, I'm down to two questions. The four-year graduation rate for African American students in high school in our two biggest school districts, Milwaukee and Madison, were 58% and 53%. What's the best way to improve African American graduation rates for high schools?
Well, two things. I think there's a whole series of things. I think one of the best things we can do, and why we put such a focus, invested money into early assessments for reading, is that if you can get kids reading at or above grade level by the time they go from 3rd to 4th grade, right about in that transition, the likelihood of them graduating goes up exponentially. It's one of those where we know, conversely, if a kid's not reading at grade level by the time they leave elementary school, they're 4 times more likely not to graduate. They're 13 times more likely if you add poverty as a factor. So we just know statistically, if kids are reading at or above grade level by the time they're leaving elementary school, and it makes sense when you think about it, because if you're behind in reading, everything else becomes a challenge. Science, math, social studies. If you can't read,
compounds.
So people just get frustrated. There are great teachers in our schools in Milwaukee and Madison. Part of their challenges, though, is if those kids are behind, if those students are behind, it becomes really, really difficult. The irony, though, of the districts you mentioned is those are 2 of the few districts left that haven't used Act 10. Now, as of this school year, Milwaukee will be off completely, and they'll be able to use them, and we'll see if they fully use the benefits out there. Madison next year will be the only school district left that hasn't used Act 10 reforms. And the irony is Madison actually has a worse African-American graduation rate, which shocks people even in Milwaukee. They have a worse African-American graduation rate than the Milwaukee public school system does.
58% versus 53%. Okay, last question, because I know you're pressed for time. In the Assembly, you sponsored, I think, the three strikes law, didn't you?
3 strikes. I did truth in sentencing.
Truth in sentencing. Critics now say that some prison inmates convicted of nonviolent crimes could be released without jeopardizing public safety. Do you believe that?
Well, and the truth in sentencing versus that, I think if you're going to do reform in the prison system, which I'm all for sentencing reform, you got to do it on the front end. The reason I did truth in sentencing wasn't to extend the amount of time that people serve in prison. It was to provide certainty to the public, to the law enforcement system, but most importantly, to the victim. To me, I remember a case where we took a hearing on this bill up in Brown County in the courthouse. A woman came in, she had been a victim of sexual assault, talked about how devastating it was to face the rapist who had done this just horrific thing to her, but that she was convinced it was okay to do that because her actions would put him away for a long time and it would protect others from going through the same thing. At that testimony almost 20 years ago, she said to us that one of the most devastating things before truth in sentencing was when she was done, one of the people from the law enforcement told her that because of the old system, this guy, even though he got, I think it was 20 years, could be out in a fraction of that because of parole and early release out there. And she said she felt victimized all over again. To me, I made certain at that point, whether it was 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, a year, whatever it might be, that for the victim's sake of any of these crimes, I wanted to make sure they knew at the time of sentencing exactly how long that person was going to be there. And so I don't want to change. If a victim's been told 10 years, I don't want to let them out in 6.5 or 7 years out there, because I think that's a disservice to the victim. Where I think you can do things is for those who are nonviolent, low-risk offenders, that's where we should be giving them more tools on the front end to say what alternatives are out there, particularly because a lot of those sorts of crimes are relatively victimless, and then empower the courts to have the tools accessible to make those sorts of options. It's got to be done on the front end so you protect the victim.
Governor Scott Walker, thanks for talking to Wisconsin.
Good to see you.
Thank you, sir.